Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents One Step Ahead by Denver Murphy, narrated by Chris Macdonnell. Chapter 1. Over at last, former Detective Superintendent Jeffrey Brandt sighed, opened his front door, and was greeted by the silence and stillness inside. The evening had been his retirement party, a forced and turgid affair, full of awkward speeches and false promises to keep in touch. Yet Brandt had accepted it with apparent good grace, conscious that it was a necessary process in his metamorphosis. No longer with a wife to insist he remove his shoes, he merely shrugged off his coat, heading into the sitting-room and straight for the drinks cabinet. At the party he had resisted the temptation to overindulge, but now safely home he could celebrate in earnest. For despite his feigned sadness at leaving the police, he could remember little in his life more worthy of celebration than this. As relieved as he was to finally be embarking on a more rewarding path, it wasn't as though Brandt wanted to forget the past. Not only would it serve as a reminder of how far he had come and what he had sacrificed along the way, he would need to draw on the skills he had honed over his long and distinguished career, if he was to be successful in this new one. When he started in the police, Brandt viewed the job as a crusade for good and righteousness. Of average height and build, he had always looked unremarkable, but stood in his uniform at the passing-out parade, his dark hair swept back with the aid of Brill-cream, and with his parents and girlfriend proudly watching on, his blue eyes had sparkled with anticipation of what was to follow. His enviable service record and reputation for solving even the most complex of cases suggested his vocation had been a success. But Brandt knew the truth. Over time, the crimes he was investigating, the affronts to decency and humanity, had come to be viewed as unpleasant and inconvenient byproducts of the modern age. Society had become so desensitized to violence, be it real or fictional, that what he was doing hardly seemed to matter any more. That it mattered to the victim and their close friends and family only made it worse when some kid out of law school was encouraged to pick holes in each bit of evidence he had gathered and every investigative method he had used. With juries seeming increasingly unwilling to reach guilty verdicts, and with many of those few convictions made being subsequently overturned, Brandt's job had become increasingly difficult. And yet the same determination that had seen him enter the police force had driven him on for a while, encouraging him to bury himself deeper in his work. He had obsessed over every detail, certain that he could make the case for the prosecution watertight. But at the same time as his marriage failed, he came to understand that he was becoming a lone voice. The decline he was seeking to reverse had already been accepted. Society had entered a slumber of indifference, and, worse still, so too had many of his colleagues. Overworked and underpaid, they had taken the route of least resistance, regarding what had once been a calling as a job, much like any other. Unable to find meaning in his work, he began to look forward to his impending retirement, but not because it would allow him to escape his troubles. He had already paid the ultimate price in his personal life, and, unless he found a purpose to his continued existence, all that awaited him was more opportunity to reflect on a life wasted. The only chance Brandt had to reconcile all that he had given to society with everything it had cost him in return was to tip the balance in his favor. Now destined not to leave a legacy through fatherhood, he could at least make his mark by reversing the decline that had seen all his hopes and aspirations unfulfilled. Freed from the shackles of the rule of law, he could channel all his knowledge and experience in a more effective direction, one that would force people to see how bad their apathy had allowed things to become. For Brandt had a particular talent, one that could not be taught, and one that was ostensibly in contrast with a conviction to do good. The ability to connect with the murderers he hunted on an emotional level, His empathetic understanding of what drove them to kill had allowed him to establish motive in the most apparently random of crimes. Spending so much time consumed by the dark thoughts of others had the combined effect of eroding Brandt's morality and allowing him to learn from their mistakes. Chapter 2. Living in Nottingham for the past 3 years had allowed Sarah to carefully perfect her Saturday routine. Although keen to punctuate the end of the working week, like most of the young teachers at her school, she resisted calls to have the typical late, alcohol-fueled Friday night. However, far from being puritanical, it was because Sarah believed that Saturday should be a day for action and activities, whilst Sunday was best suited to hangovers, television, and, if one could summon up the energy to cook, roast dinners. Braving her top-floor apartment's balcony with some freshly brewed coffee, Sarah waited for the sun to rise over the trees of Victoria Embankment Park. She knew that caffeine wasn't the ideal preparation for a session at the gym, but found the stimulant, combined with the biting air of a pre-dawn Saturday, invigorating. As she sat there watching the first rays dapple on the River Trent, it was only the longing for the cigarettes she had given up 3 months previously that prevented the scene being perfect in her eyes. Whilst no longer craving the nicotine, it was times like these that forced her to remember the pleasurable routine of smoking. In an effort to distract herself, she decided to have a quick scan of Facebook to see what she had missed the night before. Despite the school having a strict policy on staff use of social media, it only took a few moments for her to gain a comprehensive picture of the events. With the final posts not until after 3 a.m. and involving a dubious-looking kebab shop, Sarah doubted she would hear from that particular group of friends again until much later in the day. With the sun now fully visible, the coffee finished, and the cold having managed to penetrate the layers of both her white dressing-gown and black padded jacket, Sarah knew it was time to go back indoors and get changed. She would save showering until she had finished at the gym, so it was just a case of throwing on some of her exercise gear. Nevertheless, she decided to remain outside for the moment and read once again the unexpected text she had received on Thursday. It was from Josh, a man she had dated briefly the previous November. There had seemed to be some potential there, and Sarah had invited him around for dinner. Knowing where this might lead, she had gone to tremendous effort, not just with the food, but with a beauty regime that had lasted most of the previous day. His failure to show or provide any sort of explanation was first met with anger. When days followed without contact, her emotion turned to confusion and, finally, worry, when the message she sent inquiring what had happened at great personal cost to her pride was not replied to. Later, the mutual friend who had first introduced them confirmed, somewhat awkwardly, that nothing untoward had befallen him. Determined not to humiliate herself any further, Sarah had left it at that and tried to cast him from her mind. She'd be lying if she suggested she had not thought of him on occasion, but when the text came through it had been met with genuine shock. "Hi, Sarah. Hope this is still your number. Sorry about before. Can I make it up to you? Josh, X." She didn't want to respond and give him the satisfaction of showing she cared, but she was curious to find out why he had stood her up in the first place, and the reason he was making contact now. One of the things she loved most about going to the gym was that it gave her space to think. Visiting there on her way home from school every Tuesday and Thursday, on those nights she slept better than she did the rest of the week. Perhaps it had something to do with the exercise, but she believed it was more of a result of being able to process the things on her mind. However, the ability to think clearly was less welcome on this particular Saturday morning because her thoughts kept returning to Josh. It was troubling her sufficiently to see her typical routine cut short by electing to skip the 20 minutes on the cross-trainer she usually finished with. Having showered and now sitting on one of the benches in the changing room with a towel wrapped around her, she started punching in a reply. "I doubt it." Sarah convinced herself that there was nothing wrong with typing it so long as she didn't send it. Although the message itself was suitably cold, she knew that regardless of its content, the very act of replying would imply she was bothered by what had happened. Then again, it would serve to bring some form of closure and allow her to continue her weekend as normal. So engrossed was Sarah with her thoughts that she failed to notice that the towel had come undone at the top and was gradually slipping down her front. As her index finger hovered over the send button, she promised herself that regardless of what he might text back, this would be the sum total of her communication. Despite hearing the ping of the incoming message tone barely a minute later, she continued to dress, feeling that the show of strength by not immediately checking her phone vindicated her earlier decision. The same part of her that had dared to send the message now challenged her to wait until she returned to her apartment. This was something she was prepared to do, and had started walking home, until the weaker part of her convinced her that the message probably wasn't from him, and might be important. Without breaking stride, she removed the phone from her coat pocket, and a single press of the home screen lit up the display, revealing the message contents. "Do you still have the Saturday routine of some pre-lunch shopping? I'll be in the coffee shop at midday." The blast from a car horn alerted Sarah to the fact that she had stopped dead in the middle of the side street where she was crossing. Partly through shock and partly through anger at Josh's presumptuousness, she gave the driver the finger, immediately regretting it. Although her school was the other side of town, which meant it was unlikely a parent would be driving out of this particular residential street, she understood the hypocrisy of this indiscretion, given her earlier thoughts regarding her colleagues' Facebook antics. Nottingham city centre is suitably large, containing no fewer than 2 shopping malls, and if Sarah didn't want to be spotted by someone, she knew she could continue with her Saturday routine unimpeded. If she wanted a coffee at midday, there were plenty of other places she could choose from. Sure, they might not have the lemon tart she so enjoyed, but this could be her penance for not earning the treat via the cross-trainer. As she walked into town, she could feel her resolve gradually crumbling. Defiant, she convinced herself that it was her inner strength that was preventing her from wanting to be driven out of her favourite cafe. When she passed the station car park and turned from Queen Street into Carrington Road, the Broadmarsh shopping centre was firmly in view. She knew then that she would go and listen to what Josh had to say. However, in order to keep the last of her dignity, she would pick up a couple of items on the way, so it wouldn't seem that she had gone into town specifically to meet him. From the main entrance of the station, a large group of people suddenly appeared. Sarah professed to know little about football and didn't recognize which team the blue shirts belonged to. However, the sheer number of them suggested they were probably here to play Nottingham Forest, rather than their lower league local rivals, Notts County. Clearly this was a team who had played here regularly, because few stopped to get their bearings, and most were heading in the same direction as her, towards Castle Wharf's waterfront bars. Sarah was swallowed up by the crowd, only to feel herself being nudged by someone overtaking on her left, swiftly followed by contact with the lower right of her abdomen. Concerned that that was where her handbag hung, she instinctively moved her hand to the area to check it had not been snatched. As she patted the region, she could feel moisture. Holding up her fingers to the sunlight revealed blood. Almost simultaneously she felt an excruciating pain rise from her side, and her legs crumbled. As Sarah sunk to the floor, she was accidentally kicked by the person directly behind as he attempted not to trip over her. Looking up at the blue sky from the cold concrete, the edges of her vision began to narrow. Concerned shouting could be heard, accompanied by a woman screaming, but the noise seemed distant and muffled to Sarah. Darkness gradually crept in, and it was with gratitude she observed that the pain was now fading. Chapter 3. By the time Brandt arrived at Nottingham Castle, he could feel his pulse returning to normal. He paid the entrance fee in cash and proceeded around the exhibits, taking little in, and settled on a bench towards the back of the site. He wanted the opportunity to rest before embarking on the remainder of the walk back to his car, but, more than anything, he wished to take some time to reflect on what he had just achieved. Brandt had little interest in anything he had seen at the castle, but had chosen this location as a suitable point between where he had parked and where he had carried out his task. Despite being confident that he had escaped the scene without suspicion, he thought it wise to provide himself with a reason for visiting the area. The few people who knew him would be surprised to hear he had made such a trip in order to shop, but someone who had recently taken early retirement could quite conceivably wish to visit some of the country's historical sites. That he had chosen Match Day would bear no significance, especially as the city, having 2 league teams, meant there was a game each Saturday throughout the football season. Certain that the day would represent the first episode in a long and successful new career, Brandt had decided to keep his first act simple. In America, they talk about a defendant needing means, motive, and opportunity. By keeping it so simple, including the use of a generic steak knife, he had made it so that virtually every able-bodied adult could be seen to have the means to commit the crime. In terms of motive, there was absolutely none. In fact, Brandt would barely be able to describe his victim, much less have any link to them, for this was what he believed to be the single greatest factor in how he was going to escape detection. The randomness of his selection meant it neither fitted into the category of a crime of passion, nor did it suggest any real planning. As a consequence, the police's typical lines of inquiry would prove fruitless. Opportunity had been dealt with by linking an entire train's worth of people with the crime. Brandt knew that they would be looking for someone on the 10:19 direct from Birmingham New Street, which arrived in Nottingham at 11:28. Their profiling would suggest a white male in his 20s or 30s with previous convictions for violence, possible mental health issues. The police would start with CCTV footage, train ticket sales made by card, and they would probably ask for the parent club's assistance in matching these against their records of who had acquired tickets for the match. Brandt was willing to bet that, in any train full of ardent football fans, it was likely there would be a number of people who fitted the profile. The supposed simplicity of the investigation would prevent them noticing that one more person exited the station than went through the ticket gates. It was not so much the pangs of hunger, but the desire to get home and watch the news that prompted Brandt to leave the comfort of his bench. As he exited the castle grounds, he observed that the sky was becoming overcast, and he could feel the temperature dropping. Yet nothing would spoil his mood as he made his way back to his car. Much in the same way that the Internet had proven useful in helping him establish which train would contain the bulk of the away fans, Brandt had used Google Maps to identify a residential street just outside town that was quiet enough not to have CCTV, but sufficiently busy that no one would consciously observe him parking. The width of Lenton Boulevard meant that cars could park on either side without disrupting the traffic. Brandt had stopped at the foot of one of the large horse-chestnut trees that lined the road, making his movements even less noticeable. Within a couple of minutes, Brandt was on the A52, following signs back to the M1 motorway. He didn't tune into one of the local stations in case it would spoil the evening he would spend watching the various news channels on his large television. He had planned to indulge in a late lunch at Leicester Forest East services, but his impatience to return home outweighed the hunger now firmly rooted in his stomach. Chapter 4. "What the fuck?" Brandt cursed loudly from his armchair. He had arrived home just before 4 p.m. and had made himself a quick sandwich to tide him over before the Chinese takeaway he intended ordering later. On the side table to his right stood a freshly opened bottle of his favourite whiskey, a 12-year-old Glenfiddich, already with a quarter of its contents gone. Having tuned his satellite box to the correct BBC channel for the East Midlands, he had happily sat through the national news, knowing his actions would not yet merit this level of attention. However, when the local news started with the planning of a proposed wind farm near Loughborough, Brandt lost his patience. "And that's the problem with this fucking country," he shouted, berating the newsreader. He could not believe that the potential spoiling of the view for a few residents was deemed more important than the fatal stabbing of a woman by a gang of football hooligans. The truth was, though, he could well believe it. When he first started investigating murders, it was big news, if not at a national level, certainly locally. He would be able to go home once his shift was finished and relive what had happened on television, or read about it in the morning's newspaper. Nowadays, unless it was someone famous, involved children, or there was something particularly gruesome or perverse about it, barely a ripple was caused in the media. Almost as though responding to Brandt's criticism, the newsreader moved on. In other news, police are investigating the stabbing of a woman outside Nottingham train station just before midday. She was rushed to the Queen's Medical Centre and is thought to be in a critical condition. After a brief pause, she continued, "With around 60 minutes gone, Nottingham Forest are—" "Is that it?" Brandt switched off the television. With prior thoughts of Szechuan beef and egg-fried rice cast from his mind, he proceeded to work through the bottle of whiskey in earnest. "Heartless bitch," he slurred at the blank screen. More than the mere 2 sentences afforded to what had happened, it was the monotone and passionless delivery by the newsreader that offended Brandt most. The more he thought of it, the more it reminded him of the way his wife had told him she was leaving almost 3 years before. The way she had said it, the tired, resigned delivery that morning over breakfast, devoid of any feeling, told him all he needed to know about his chances of convincing her otherwise. Rather than saying anything, he had simply left for work, only to find her, along with her personal items, gone when he returned. There had been little contact and none face-to-face since then, the ease of their parting after 15 years uncomplicated by their lack of children. Brandt knew it was their failure to successfully reproduce that had caused the most damage, even before the one message from her since which wasn't purely about money. "It's not as though I didn't have offers. I gave you the best years of my life, and you gave me nothing." They hadn't planned to have children straight after they got married, but neither did they attempt to prevent it. It was only after a few years, and once all her friends of roughly the same age had families, that she convinced him they should see a doctor. Although the instinct was not as strong for Brandt, he was not averse to becoming a parent, and, more than anything, he wanted his wife to be happy. He was sure any man would be only too pleased to have their sperm count come back as healthy, and was similarly relieved to hear that his wife was not suffering from any complications herself. They had been told to just give it time and to not put pressure on themselves. However, Brandt soon felt the pressure. The more often he received that accusing stare over breakfast following coming home too late from work the night before, falling asleep in his chair after too much whiskey, or offering some kind of explanation why he wasn't in the mood, the less he wanted to make love. By then it had become a biological process anyway, devoid of passion. Any suggestion of foreplay was just there to get him to the stage where he could perform. With her lying motionless and silent beneath him, he could sense her impatience when the task took longer than normal. The combination of the reducing number of occasions and the frequency with which Brandt was unable to finish conspired to make the time that had still seemed so abundant when in their mid-30s run out. There was nothing Brandt could do to correct that now. Sure, he was probably still able to father children, but there was only one woman with whom he had wanted to start a family. Nevertheless, he was certain that he could fix the other problem that troubled him. What he intended to do was to shock England to its very core. He would make the people sit up and pay attention. They would no longer ignore or gloss over the darkness that blighted society. As he neared the bottom of the bottle and could feel sleep washing over him, Brandt's thoughts turned to the girl. When he plunged the blade into her kidney, it was with the intention of creating death. Despite his intoxicated state, he could recall the moment with vivid clarity, the sun glinting on her golden hair as it bounced on her shoulders, and the way she indicated where she wanted the knife to go as she moved to counter the glancing impact of the person passing her on the left. Brandt had been surprised by the ease with which the knife had entered her body all the way to its hilt. He had detected the fragrance she had applied that morning and instantly decided the visceral brutality of twisting the knife to open up a hole would be unfitting of the beauty of the moment. Closing his eyes, Brandt hoped that final decision would go on to save her life. Chapter 5. Josh entered the interview room convinced he was in some form of a nightmare from which he would soon awaken. "Thank you for coming to help us with our investigations, Mr. Ramage," Detective Chief Inspector Stella Johnson said, sitting down and gesturing for Josh to do the same. DCI Johnson was the same woman who had knocked on his front door a short while earlier and was leading the team investigating the stabbing of Sarah Donovan. She was in her mid-30s, athletic and sharply dressed in a trouser suit. With resources in the department stretched owing to the number of lines of inquiry being pursued, she had been irritated to find even her newest detective, D.C. Hardy, unavailable. She punished D.I. Fisher's presumptuousness in allocating him a task without her permission by having him go and get the duty sergeant to spare her an officer from uniform. P.C. McNeil was new to the force, and Johnson had made it clear to him on the journey over that he was there merely to make up the numbers, his role simply to observe. "Look, don't I need a lawyer or something?" Josh asked. Although not prone to claustrophobia, he found the grey room oppressive. He could feel beads of sweat forming on his brow. "At this stage you were just helping us with our inquiries. You came here voluntarily and are free to leave at any point." Johnson paused deliberately. "But you can have a lawyer if you feel you need one." "Okay," inquired McNeil. Josh, staring at his hands, missed the swift glance of admonishment Johnson gave her colleague. "I guess so," he responded, lifting his head and interpreting McNeil's nod as one of reassurance. The truth was he felt far from okay. When he observed the police car from his sitting-room window, followed by the knock at his door, he knew he was in trouble. Although the news report he had seen the previous evening, whilst waiting to watch the goals from the Forest match, had given very few clues as to the identity of the victim, he now understood it must have been Sarah. Given he barely knew her, much less had seen her recently, he was sure that their call was not for the purpose of informing him. In a state of panic, he had decided to pretend that what they were telling him had come as a complete shock. Johnson took a long draught of coffee from the styrofoam cup she had collected on the way through the police station. "Can you start by telling us about your relationship with Miss Donovan?" "Relationship?" asked Josh in a louder and shriller tone than he would have liked. "Yes, relationship," repeated Johnson evenly. "We weren't in a relationship." Johnson sighed and avoided the temptation to roll her eyes. "Your relationship with Sarah, meaning how you know her." Josh paused. "We went on a couple of dates a while back." And that's it." Why did the relationship end, Josh? Johnson was doing her utmost to keep her increasing exasperation with this man hidden. She had completed a quick background check before they collected him.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?